So we've reached our appointed starting time, ladies and gentlemen. I think we may as well launch our webinar today. So my first pleasant duty is to wish everyone good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're viewing from, and to welcome you to this FOGS webinar. We thank you very much for joining, whether on Zoom or on Facebook. And I would like to express a real appreciation as you have chosen to come to this FOGS webinar and forego your chance to watch the exciting General Assembly debate coming to you from New York. So I hope that in our webinar today, we'll be able to give you something that's at least as stimulating as what you would get from the heads of state and government speaking in the General Assembly virtually. I'm Richard Kinley. I'm the president of FOGS, the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability. We decided to organize this webinar today as our contribution to the 75th anniversary celebrations of the UN. It's a big event which we think needs to be marked. We also were quite interested to put our ideas where our mouths are, if I may use that turn of phrase. We feel that criticism of the UN is not enough, and certainly despair over the current situation is even worse. What we need now are new ideas to get us out of the current rather unsatisfactory situation that that the world finds itself in. So we've thrown out or tabled for consideration a couple of proposals or options. We understand very much that they're not perfect options, and they're certainly not the only options, but we wanted to promote a discussion amongst people who are interested in and concerned about the United Nations system and its agencies. We wanted to promote a discussion about how we can move out of this current unsatisfactory situation. We're looking for, in the discussion today, your advice, your comments, pro and con. Please don't hesitate to be critical. We really want to benefit from the discussion, but we also want to hear other new ideas that might be of interest to our wider community. So we could work on these and ideally help to make the UN's fourth quarter century somewhat better than the last quarter century. We can now sort of move into the mechanics of our discussion. The webinar today will run about 90 minutes. We will have 3 blocks of discussion. The first is on a proposal that we at FOGS have presented on a narrative for hope and resilience. There'll be a presentation by one of us. Then we'll have comments from a number of discussants, and that will be followed by a response to those comments. We'll then move into the second block, which is in a similar format, a presentation on the idea of a Global Resilience Council, followed by comments from discussants and a wrap-up or response to those comments. We'll then move into the third block, which is a wider discussion where we'll be inviting those of you who are attending via Zoom, but also those of you who are viewing on Facebook to join in that conversation. If you're on Zoom, I will be asking those interested to make a comment to indicate so by raising your hand in the Zoom function, or if you're on Facebook, we'll be asking you to send your questions, and we'll be monitoring those, hoping we can digest them and bring them either to the presenters or to the discussants, so that we can have a good conversation. And in that spirit, I wanted just to comment that I was reading recently a piece by Patrick Wintour, who's one of our discussants, where he was lamenting the state of of Zoom diplomacy, because there is an absence of real interaction. I think we've all experienced this. It's quite true. So I'm going to be trying my best to encourage at least a bit of interaction amongst the discussants and amongst the participants, so that we can get the most possible out of this Zoom discussion. I'll be keeping an eye on the time, so presenters and discussants may hear a little dinging sound, which will be a reminder that it's getting close to the time to wrap up. So without further ado, I will now turn to the first block of our webinar today and invite Yorgos Kostakos, my dear friend and executive director of FOGS, to tell us about the idea of a narrative of hope and resilience. Yorgos, please.
Thank you, Richard. And thanks from me to all those who are here as discussant participants or on Facebook. We had a small problem, I understand, with Facebook, but we're resolving it and it will be webcast live very soon. To start with, here is the presentation. A narrative of hope and resilience for human dignity and well-being. That's the full name of this proposal. And every word counts in this case, particularly. To get started, we go to the first slide. Why did we want this debate to start? Because we see that the post-World War narrative, World War II narrative, has run its course and it's no longer satisfactory. It's running out of steam and it's not mobilizing anymore. And also it's proven in practice that the creations of the Second World War and the creators don't have the same level of commitment and efficiency and effectiveness these days. So we need something else. And we also have a convergence of crises, which increases the sense of insecurity for people. And also there is actual hardship among citizens. So we cannot ignore that. We cannot just paper over it. The sense of insecurity, as I think one of our discussants also will mention later, is very important in upsetting social structures, the economy, etc. We need to reverse the regression in terms of democratic values, in terms of commitment to fighting poverty, human migration, gender rights, global cooperation. We have a sense that we're going backwards. We have a sense that if we tried now to negotiate any of these grand treaties, universal human rights, etc., we would get worse texts and lower commitments. So we have to change that. Then we need to enhance the capacity to oppose the rise of nationalism, intolerance, and militarism, which are taking over. Many leaders see it as a convenient tool to get elected. I don't know how far they do believe in it, but they encourage it, and that can be destructive, as we've seen on previous occasions in humanity's history and the wars that ensued afterwards. We need to enhance also the capacity to inspire a new urgency to address climate change. Climate change is not gone because we're talking about COVID-19, and also biodiversity loss, species extinction. That's happening so fast, and we can see how that affects also even the health of human beings. And finally, we need to build on the overall sense of anxiety in a positive way, right? Because we see also from the ashes something rising, which is the sense of human perseverance, of human resilience. And if we manage to direct it in a positive way towards we can make it together, not this country first or the other country first, against all odds, then we may have achieved something big. This is the starting point. Then we go to the elements of a new narrative. It is, as we have said, a zero draft, which means what we propose now is on the table, but needs a lot of more work and contributions from everybody to get to a stage where it can be really used fully. But we recognize two kinds of elements. One is the more classical kind of element, a solid ground that we already have to build on. For example, a hope for the future. As I said, not everything is bleak. We have to put emphasis on that. Strengthening the existing visions that unite us. We have the UN Charter, it's still valid, we the peoples, and working together to avoid war, to increase development, sustainable development, and defend human rights, the Universal Declaration, and of course the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. These are frameworks that we have all agreed to, and they're still there, valid, but they need a bit of a tweaking to be adjusted to the requirements of today. A renewed focus on guaranteeing both individual and societal resilience and well-being I think we are often lost in terms of what we focus on. Is it the greatness of a state? Is it the GDP, economic figures? I think it would be good to focus on individual and societal resilience, the capacity to withstand shocks, and the well-being of people. And protect the vulnerable and leave no one behind. We've promised it many times, but I don't think we're really doing it. And for planet Earth, our common home, we need to address anthropogenic climate change, species extinction, pollution. All these things exist in the Paris Agreement, for example, for climate, but we have to include them in the new narrative in a more proactive and humane, engaging way. And going to the last substantive slide, which is the new elements of the narrative, which are a bit more innovative. You could say some of them revolutionary, perhaps, which means what I say here is reversing the causal chain for the future. And by that I mean, up to now we say, oh, we expect the system as it works to lead to something positive. But it would be time to start from what positive we want to see and tweak the system backwards. So reversing this causal chain. For example, health is a global public good. I think we have seen it in practice. We don't need to debate it anymore. How can we make it a reality for everybody, with or without pre-existing conditions, with health systems all over the world? Then a resilient and equitable economic system. It's also a global public good. The economy as it is now does not work for everybody. Increases inequalities, increases insecurities, leads to cycles of downward spirals often and crisis. So how can we start from the point that we need the economy to be a system that works for the well-being of everybody and the resilience of societies and people, and build backwards from there? Cyberspace is a global commons. It needs rules, it needs policing, it needs guarantees of rights, like in the actual space when you go out to a square or somewhere. And also it cannot be voluntary. It cannot be left only to the companies that make money out of this. Racial, ethnic, religious, social, and gender diversity, and I would say also culinary diversity. The food that we eat is mankind's treasured heritage. I mean, we should celebrate it, and we should not try to explain to people why they should not be racist or whatever nationalist in a destructive way. We start from humanities, this rich hodgepodge of things over time created, and we celebrate it. The long-term effectiveness and legitimacy of global governance rests on an ethical foundation, and that's what we treasure here at FOGS. We have our grand narrative and hexalog, some basic rules to govern personal and institutional behavior. And I always say that the values and ethics are the condensed wisdom of time, of centuries and millennia. We don't need to rediscover that if you become super nationalistic, etc., and you close your borders, then you can go to war with the other nation or the group of nations. So, I mean, ethics is really don't do harm. It does not need to be rediscovered every time that its value. And finally, this new narrative that we hope will make together and will be expanded through the UN also needs to be reflected in a new architecture of global governance. And I think the next presentation is part of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yorgos, for that very rich presentation and overview of the ideas. Before turning to our discussants who are with us live, we will hear a comment from a pre-recorded comment from Christiana Figueres, who is the founding partner of Global Optimism, former UNFCCC Executive Secretary, my ex-boss, and one of my heroes. So, Christiana, if Arturo could run Christiana's message, please. Thank you.
Hello, friends. Many thanks to FOGS for the invitation to join you today. I am sorry that I can't be live on Zoom with you. but I was actually already committed to yet another part of the usual Zoom marathons that we have these days. So I apologize that I can't be there. So I'm pre-recording a message for you, and I am particularly sorry that I can't be there live at the time that you're meeting, because it is precisely my very good friends Richard and Georgos who are holding the space for this very important conversation. So before you enter in your conversations, I just had a few thoughts that I wanted to share with you in case they're helpful to keep them in consideration. So first, a word on optimism and resilience. Many people ask me, why am I such a stubborn optimist? Well, the quick answer to that question is because it's the only thing we can afford to be. Yes, we have bad news almost every day, whether it's geopolitical bad news or it's some other kind of bad news. But the fact is that we know that despite everything that is happening today, in the medium term, which is the next 10 years, we have to be able to cut our global greenhouse gas emissions by half by 2030. That is the eye of the needle through which we have to go in order to be able to be at net zero by 2050, and in order to open the door to a world that is much better than the world that we're living in right now. It's the only way. And if it's the only way to get there, then we cannot afford to accept that we would be walking in any other direction. We have to stay the course. We have to be stubbornly optimistic. We have to engage every day with the decision that we will garner every single inch of our creativity, every single ounce of our ingenuity, our innovation capacity, and above all, our collaboration capacity, and focus it on the solutions in order to go through that eye of the needle. If we accept the bad news today and just sit back and assume that that's going to be the reality forever, then we have condemned our children and our grandchildren to a world of constant misery and destruction, which is not what any of us want. So, in the face of bad news, we cannot despair and fall into paralysis. That is exactly in the darkest moments when we have to pick ourselves up by the bootstraps and be optimistic, be resilient to all of that which would pull us down, because it is that resilience that will actually get us a step farther. And personal resilience is, of course, directly linked to global resilience, the issue that you will be discussing today.
I can only, having worked closely with Christiana for quite a number of years, underline that this is a woman who embodies the concept of optimism and of getting things done, and of, in public policy, not being focused on the problems, but rather on the solutions, and ensuring that people can understand that there is a positive way forward out of life's current problems. So with that, we'll now turn to our discussants, who will come in with brief comments on the proposal. And I would start with, first of all, Barbara Adams, who is the board chair of the Global Policy Forum and a professor at the New School, New York. Barbara, please.
Thank you very much. And I should say at the outset that my comments are basically learned from being originally, if you like, an outsider, working on issues to do with the UN, and then for 2 decades working for different parts of the United Nations. And now, as you've mentioned, Global Policy Forum and the New School. And frankly, my experience as maybe one of the first official, or not even the first, card-carrying schizophrenics, which I'm about to demonstrate in all its glory, I imagine, a very concerned but committed person. The first thing to say is I completely agree we need a new narrative. There's no doubt that the threats to security are not only military, but we have to also recognize the militarization, if you like, securitization that extends well beyond military expenditures and well beyond armed forces of various sorts into well-being and justice in all kinds of manifestations. And my comments here, because of the shortness of time, are going to focus more on what is not said in the narrative that we're discussing than to go through and say, yes, 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 tick, 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 to the various points that are there. So first of all, I do think that the way in which we've moved forward with how the UN is adapted or working in its various different pillars has basically been immobilizing the extraterritorial obligations and the extraterritorial manifestations in so many areas of these threats. Climate change, COVID are some obvious examples, but not only. And the burden is put completely on domestic, national response. Frankly, that gives me a quibble with the word resilience, because I think one of the things we really have to also make adjustment to, or to make changes, is we really have to look closely at the need to redistribute the burden of adjustment to the current realities that we face. And that takes me immediately to this wanting to ask a few more questions about what do we mean by together. We know that in the decision making at the moment, which is a problem, we have weighted voting, as in the Security Council, for example. But I would like to say that we actually have weighted voting throughout the practices. We've got to look at the reality that almost the 3 top contributors to the UN development system as a whole come from 3 countries only. And this is not just the assessed contributions regular budget. And if you add the next 7 contributors to that, we are looking at them accounting for 3/4 of all of the funding of all of the activities that the United Nations is mandated to perform. And the profile won't surprise you. I mean, China is in there, Brazil creeps in, but the profile is still the same profile that we've been describing with regard to, if you like, the traditional practices that we saw around development cooperation, ODA. That, I think, is also leading me to want to say something that I find very missing, is the emphasis on inequalities. Inequalities, multi-dimensional, income and non-income inequalities. We are articulate in how we see them played out within different areas like health, like climate, but then we seem to call for resilience. We need to talk about prevention. We need to redefine crisis. We need to recognize that so many of the crises that we face, which seem to want an immediate impact, have resulted from decades of failure of policies. Where is the UN on the prevention side of it? I think the UN would be much better served to have a much better risk analysis, risk assessment type of function in all kinds of different ways. It's tough. One of the comments I would make, so much of the burden in this narrative is put on the Secretary General and senior staff to speak up, now the current Secretary General, I have to say, the Nelson Mandela lecture, he has frequently said power isn't given, it has to be taken. He's queried and said the inadequacy of the GDP. Okay, we have that, but how do we go further than that? One other thing, and then I'll give you my 3 final points, or rather, well, my final points. One other thing that the narrative also talks about is the importance of public support, the ethical dimension. Again, I think that's clearly there now. So why isn't it having an impact? And in fact, in many cases, because of people feeling the growing irrelevance of the UN to their lives, we are losing some of that support. One of the directions that is being put forward is this concept of partnerships. I have a lot of problems with partnerships. Partnership seems to be a step from regarding people as shareholders to now regarding them as stakeholders. The bottom line is people are rights holders. And the bottom line for me is that the United Nations needs to be a champion of the public sector. Again, the narrative is articulate on tycoons and oligarchs, but not on the systems and the institutions that have been captured and detoured in that particular direction. At that level, it's not about individuals. So my last few comments here, for this to move forward, I think one, we need to dethrone GDP as the paramount and premier measure of success. It clearly might work for Wall Street, but I don't think, and it might even be used too much by the IMF and the World Bank in terms of how they decide which countries are at different stages for their lending. I haven't got time to get into it. We need more than likely a one-term Secretary General because of the not the Security Council, and also even outside the Security Council, you just threaten with the budget. I've already mentioned the problems there. You have a lot of effect. Extraterritorial obligations across the board need to be taken care of, not this piecemeal approach that we pick and choose when we pay attention to them. And I think absolutely the linchpin to get any of this started, we need a new funding compact. For the 40th anniversary commemoration of the United Nations, Olof Palme made the statement on that occasion that no country should be allowed to contribute more than 10% of the assessed contributions. Those ideas have been taken up in a couple of different areas. It's not the solution, but without addressing these issues as well, I fear a lot of the other things that are so important might not actually get off the talking shop part of our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for some really interesting ideas and feedback. I know that I'm pretty confident that some of the people who follow will pick up your points, in particular on equality and on GDP. So let's now move to our next discussant, Albena Azmanova, who is a professor at the University of Kent, Brussels campus. Albena.
Albena, you're muted.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Richard. Now, the document articulates, the narrative proposal articulates very well the need for abandoning the existing economic model that puts emphasis on free trade and liberal economics, and replacing it with a new approach to running the global economy. I salute the stress on resilience rather than prosperity and affluence that have been very prominent in existing narratives. Indeed, a resilient and equitable economic system is a public good. Okay. But it seems to me, however, that the diagnosis of the problem to which this is a solution is a bit incomplete, and I will make a proposal for a small adjustment. Now, in the first part of the document, the consequence of the old model of the economy is presented as, on the one side, inequality, on the other, job and food insecurity. To quote, extreme emphasis on efficiency and profit maximization has been exacerbating inequalities and leaving vulnerable populations in precarious situations. Now, surely this is true, but it seems to me that what the pandemic has exposed is rather that our societies, despite the unprecedented wealth they have amassed as a result of the previous economic model, they nevertheless turn out to be strikingly brittle, to the extent that these affluent societies could not cope with such basic tasks as providing simple protective equipment for doctors and nurses, or enabling systematic testing of the population, something that seems very basic indeed. So something is wrong there. And this is the issue. What we should be seeing on display is not so much the inequality and the fragility of the most poor populations, which is undoubtedly a problem, but the generalized fragility of society. So not just job and food insecurity or the precarity of the poor, but what I describe in my writing as the massive precarity, the massive fragility of society. Now, it is important to bear in mind that precarity and inequality are different problems, and they have to be tackled on their own with a specific focus, because they're not directly correlated with one another. And it seems to me that this particular document, the first zero draft, presents inequality as a reason for precarity. I quote, "A resilient and equitable economic system characterized by fair incomes and fair taxation should be treated as a basic infrastructure or precondition for achieving a common good." I would question this a bit. The overarching problem is that emphasis on profit has led to disinvestment in the public sector. This has made our societies precarious. This condition of general vulnerability will persist even if we were to reduce the inequality drastically between people. Our societies can be perfectly equal in terms of personal income and distribution of wealth, but still fragile because of lack of investment in the public sector. And that is both in public services and in public enterprises. Because if we want to reduce the stress on competition and on profit seeking, we need also to strengthen public enterprises. So rather, we need more resources to be invested in strengthening the commons, in public policy, in a social safety net. This is how the political economy of resilience should be seen. But now we come to the very tricky issue of growth, because we need to be frank that to secure the material resources that need to be invested for strengthening the commons, growth is the usual answer. But it is the commitment to growth over the past decades that has helped alleviate poverty to a great extent. It has increased the general prosperity of the world, with two side effects: inequality and the destruction of the environment. So we need to scrutinize our formula for growth again. This is where I want to stop.
Thank you very much, Albena, for those really interesting thoughts, which I think are a nice complement to what we've already heard. And reinforce some of the points about inequality, about the public sector, etc. Now I would ask that Jimena Leiva Roesch share with us her perspectives on this topic. Jimena is a senior fellow at the International Peace Research Institute in New York. Jimena.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, at the International Peace Institute. And I don't know if it was by coincidence, but I salute you for the gender equality, and the fact that all the women are speaking first is rather uncommon. So thank you so much. After reading the article and the documents that you have put forward, there's three things that come to play in my work, and that's going to be the subject of my talk. The first is leadership, imagination, and an inclusive multi-layered governance system. So I'll speak about those 3 points, and then I'll offer a potential solution, a way forward. So first of all, I think it's important to focus on narrative, because we create meaning through communication. It's not only a tool to pass messages, it's a way in which we create purpose. So when we speak, we not only communicate, but we do a lot more than that. So COVID-19, in my view, has disrupted our meta-narrative. In New York, we never believed that, where I am right now, that the city would be vulnerable. it has challenged our reality in ways unimaginable. In this circumstance, there's a window of opportunity to change the narrative in a very big way. As a former diplomat in the G77, we always said, you know, you had the time to develop, now it's our time. Richard, I'm sure you heard that multiple times in UNFCCC. Right now, who wants to follow this model of the West with the increased pollution, with the US being the country with the highest numbers of deaths of COVID-19? We are living a paradigm shift. The problem right now is that the vacuum on a positive narrative, and I would love to hear what The Guardian says, because I love The Guardian. The absence of a positive narrative has led for the hatred, the polarization, the negative narratives to reemerge, to take hold of the media, and all the kernels of hope have been completely diminished. And the UN, the stories that we already have and are already there, they don't receive the attention of the media. They don't exist for the mainstream media. So we need a new approach. We need a new approach, and that's my second point, which is we need to expand our imagination. To expand our imagination, we need to contact media moguls. We need to talk to the people that created Star Wars, that has really built and know how to tell a story, because we're diplomats. I don't know how to tell a story, you know? But so we need help. The UN needs help. We need help on how to tell this story. The story is already there. It's just that we don't know how to tell it. So how do we expand our imagination? How do we create books for children? Like, it has to be throughout the life cycle of a person that needs to be re-educated of a narrative of hope rather than a narrative of horror and despair and isolation. So that's my second point. The third point is leadership and the multi-layered governance system. Here, I agree with Barbara that it's not on the burden of the SG, because right now the moral voice of the SG has been unfortunately diminished. And I have my book, which I always carry, and that the SG always has to walk a very the edge of the sword, you know, between quiet diplomacy and taking a stand. And so in order for the SG to be effective, it needs a coalition of the willing. We created the SDGs not with the big powers. It was Colombia, Guatemala, the United Arab Emirates, and Peru, who for the first 2.5 years set the Sustainable Development Goals, and we were thought as crazy people, 2 of us women, of course. And so the coalition of the willing is not going to come from the big powers who are in complete disarray right now. It has to come from the small and medium powers, much more broader than the multilateral alliance right now. And it has to be much more inclusive, because we're no longer in a member state-centric world. It has to include youth, it has to include business, it has to include all the positive bright spots that are already there into a mega coalition that will hit the pushback against all that's good and ethical in the world. So I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jimena. Some really excellent points. Again, the role of the Secretary General being prominent in this, a good point for discussion. Our last discussant on this topic is Tom Weiss, a president at the City University of New York Graduate Center and fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Tom.
Oh, thanks, Richard and Yorgos, and thanks to Fogs for fighting a good fight. Yorgos, you started off saying you have a short title. I'm going to try to parse just the 3 words in it. I think in this age of nationalism, nativism, populisms, you know, I found this piece actually fun. Because turning the UN supertanker is not going to occur because we have a clever technocratic or institutional suggestion. And I'll say more about that in the second one. But we need a compelling vision, hence the new narrative. And I would argue, in fact, that this reflects the comparative advantage of the UN. And this is based on 100 oral histories and 15 university press books that I did with Sir Richard Jolly and Louis Emery, the late Louis Emery. You know, we can't be against better peacekeeping and better inoculations for kids and on and on and on, but the real payoff comes from big ideas, norms, principles, standards, and their monitoring. What's puzzling, of course, is that this is the infinitesimal part of the UN budget. The Hammarskjöld Foundation has calculated at most, if you add everything in and hope for the best, it's far less than 10% of what the system does. So I'm glad that Christina emphasized optimism. My sidekick Gareth Evans used to say that you know, he was an optimist because he wanted to be wrong sometimes, and if he were a pessimist, he didn't want to be right sometimes. But I think the good cheer in the document is maybe a little misplaced. The document refers to the first 75 years, which implies that, you know, we can count on some more, and I'm not so sure. So hope, but a deep dive into the ugly moment we're in, drinking champagne remotely, multilateralism in any shape, form is under siege. So we're all singing of global citizenship, but the age of me first goes far beyond Washington, D.C. The speeches yesterday, there was Duterte, Bolsonaro, the whole gang, and right-wing cabals everywhere. And it seems to me the document wants to avoid being pessimistic, but it's ignoring that totally. And I think that it's also, I'm glad that, you know, small countries took the initiative in the SDGs, but part of the global dirge is being sung by the global South, and in particular the emerging powers, who say, well, that post-war multilateral order it's a relic, it's brought to you and made for and by the West. So that isn't helping either. So it seems to me that, Yorgos, you asked something about ethics. It seems to me that we're talking, if there's going to be any hope, it has to be situational ethics. It has to be consequentialism. We can't have absolute statements of principles. And in fact, I would suggest that a good subtitle for this would be the title of a book done by an old friend of mine, Arthur Helton, who actually died in the bombing in Baghdad. And he said, we can't afford the price of indifference. And it seems to me that this narrative is aimed directly at dispelling the price of indifference. So let me stop there, Richard.
Thanks very much, Tom. I really appreciate that idea of dispelling the price of indifference. You've given us a lot to think about, not the most positive messages, but definitely reflecting many of the challenges we face, which were behind the idea of the proposal in the first place. I was also very struck by your suggestion that this, in fact, is an area that's a comparative advantage for the UN. So, Yorgos, you've had a lot of feedback. Oh, actually, before I come to you, I would just ask if anyone else would like to come in for a quick second comment or first comment, and then we'll move to a wrap-up.
Just a quick one. I mean, the climate change process, in a sense, showed how we didn't focus on what the other side reaction to what we were suggesting was. So it's all very well as having a strategy of how we would like to create something positive, but you have to think about what the reaction from the other side will be, and do that at the beginning, because before long, as we saw with climate change, they managed to mobilize those a narrative that was not helpful to us addressing what is, you know, clearly a critical issue for the world. So I just think we need to have an understanding of where the pushback will come And to some extent, Tom talked about that in the context of the growth of right-wing governments and populist movements.
Thank you, Felix. Thank you.
Could I piggyback
Barbara, yeah.
on that very quickly? To say that if our narrative is successful, it will be co-opted. We've seen that over and over again in all kinds of ways. And we really need to accompany anything like this, whether it's in this piece or elsewhere, with a real understanding that there is institutional, long-term capacity commitment, and therefore multi-year funding, et cetera, to actually be able to pursue what we're talking about in the face of, frankly, the current ways of undermining or co-opting those kinds of directions. I didn't think it belonged in this piece, but Felix has inspired me to be a little bit more realistic. As he knows, I spend my life wobbling between realism and hope. No, I'm always hopeful. Ciao, ciao.
Thanks, Barbara. Okay, Yorgos, over to you for a quick, oh, sorry, Albena. For a quick comment, yeah.
There was a good comment from the chat I would like actually to introduce here about boosting the capacity of state. I would rather state we need indeed to emphasize that we need to recover the capacity of public authority, maybe not the state, but public authority at any level, at municipal, state, international, to take care of the population. Because over the past 40 years, there has been a persistent shift from public authority to private economic actors. So we need to regain that territory, and this needs to be reflected in our narrative. Thank you.
Thanks, Albena. Yorgos, the semi-last word is yours.
Thank you very much. Amazing contributions. Thanks a lot. I hope we are in it together, committed to develop it further. I can see many good comments about the conceptual clarity that is needed, of course, and in the economy, distinction between precarity and inequality. I can see also the fact that not everybody is equal. We're not starting from the same. There is a Western element in all that. The extreme privatization, profit motivation, etc. Alternative narratives, meaning that if we don't have a positive narrative, we'll get the negative narratives, which are partial in countries or groups, but still they can carry the day and take us to a place we don't want to be. Also the fact that we need the narrative really to work on it as a piece of art, and we're lucky to have among us also at least one artist that I know, Piera van de Ville, who does music, and through her music also helps create a new narrative for the SDGs and beyond. So there is hope, and there are actions in all these areas. We didn't have the time to put them all in one paper or in one presentation. But I also would like to caution, for example, Barbara, we cannot become again all the poor people or the people who have rights. People have rights and responsibilities. I think we should not be populist even in the enlightened camp to let people off the hook. There is a need for an effort from all people to do it. And in developed and developing countries. Also, I would not like to go back to a model of developed countries have to pay for development. For me, the quality of life that some developing countries, so-called, may have, irrespective of the GDP figures, and is higher in terms of human element and even resilience than developed countries that are so precarious. If you don't get your salary 1 month in the US or in Europe, you completely fall off. And at least in Europe, you have your healthcare probably secured, but in the US, we don't even have that. So, I mean, who is more resilient? I wonder. And we need a big coalition, as Jimena said, and I hope that we can work on that. And the UN, finally, as Tom said, for me also, it's the repository of this common humanity and common sense of belonging and working together. So that's why we have so many expectations from the Secretary General and everybody. But of course, it's more than that. It's each and everybody, and each one of us. And we have created FOGS as a way of really like a moral niche institution, which doesn't want to be big or to be very operational, but to keep this flame and hopefully working with others to spread it around and uncapture our minds and our public sphere from what is now has taken over. And public sphere is different from the public sector, I would say, because there have been many bad uses of the public sector in countries and also by people who benefit from their salaries or status there and bureaucracies, etc. So we have to rethink that too, I think. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Yorgos. So you've noted the homework that is to be done to follow up on this. We'll take more comments from the webinar attendees a bit later, but now we'll turn to the second idea, option, suggestion, which is for a global resilience council. And we'll have a brief introduction of this idea from one of the FOGS advisory board members, Harris Gleckman. Harris, please.
Thank you for taking some time from everyone who is part of this discussion and on the Facebook to think about some of these ideas. Can we go to the next slide, please? I want to introduce this by just two pieces of background. One is to talk about the need for a new institution. Now we're being very practical. How do we translate some of these tough questions into institutional supports? I think that what we're trying to accomplish, and the second part is to look at the possible institutional arrangements for a global resilience council. I want to say that this is a draft 0, if there was possible to have a draft -2. This is to start a discussion, to get a debate going, and we need ideas about whether this is a sound direction and the particular ways of doing this. The institutional arrangements section needs to be very clear that it's just a possible route that could make the idea credible. The primary moment is to talk about building a sense of the need for such a new institution. Next slide, please. I want to suggest that there are 4 primary needs. One is, as many have said, there are a scale of unresolved issues reaching across environment, human rights, health, gender, economics, which the current system cannot address. And I think that we need to be honest about the limitations of that. And I think that we need to say that we need to build an institution that is respectful of the fact that the world has changed. Post-World War II, the issue of security was a military security. The issues today which we are facing are across a whole range of issues, and they have no equivalent type of body to address them at the international level. Second reason why we need an institution is that voluntarism is not working. The League of Nations functioned to try to deal with voluntary avoidance of war. It didn't work. The Security Council was created. We now need to see that the voluntarism around the climate system, around implementation of the global Sustainable Development Goals, the WHO's advice, a whole multi-stakeholder standard setting, this voluntarism is not working. We need to create a new obligatory body that can make some of these realities effective. The third reason is we need a whole of government approach. Each of the organizations, whether it's the World Health Organization or the climate folks, they've worked very, very hard, but because all these crises are more expansive, it needs a whole of government response that engages with the economic sides of governments, the labor sides, etc., which cannot come out of our fragmented, specialized agency system. we need a whole of government structure to address these kinds of crises. And fourth, there's really no existing body that can do this. As I indicated, each of the bodies have tried their best or have around themselves reached the limits of their legal authority. And so we need to open a new vantage point for addressing that. There have been calls in the past for economic security councils. There have been calls for sustainable development councils. This proposal is in line with that direction. So these are some of the reasons why I think we want to put on the table a need for a new institution. Next slide, please. To make this argument credible, you have to suggest, is it possible institutionally to do that? The paper has identified 11 different pieces of that story. And I want to reiterate that the particular suggestions in the paper are steps along the way to envisioning that it might be possible. So today, in the spirit of trying to get further discussion, I want to pick two areas which I think the paper has made and offers serious advances, and two areas where it's quite clear we need more work. One area is in the creation. The suggestion is that the various intergovernmental bodies that currently exist would create the Global Resistance Council as subsidiary bodies of their existing arrangements, so that the FAO could create a subsidiary body of the Global Resistance Council. The World Bank could declare this a subsidiary body. The General Assembly can do that. That would allow the majority of the governments to create jointly an international body. The other, which I think is in good shape, or for discussion, are the enforcement tools. There are presented six different enforcement tools, some of which are borrowed on the economic side from tools that the Security Council uses. Some are involved more public participation, as modeled on the list of foreign investors in South Africa. Others are modeled on reaching out for criminal and liability issues to both international and national courts. And there are various fact-finding routes. Underlying that, because it will be a subsidiary body of all the other existing bodies, which could include regional bodies, it could also direct cross-organizational attention to issues far better than any existing structure. Where we clearly need some additional thinking is on the membership. There's a sense that it should both be an intergovernmental body. There's a sense that we need to get non-state actors in, and we have various balances to strike of how to create such a diverse structure. If you say that you wish to have non-state bodies involved, to take civil society organizations, what's your selection process? Or for the business community, what's your selection process? So we need additional thought about that. We also made some suggestions about decision-making. We created two tiers of decision-making to say that certain kinds of actions to enforce the decision, putting something on the agenda of all the UN systems, could be done by simple majority. Others needed a higher level of voting. But now that we have a mixture of state and non-state actors, and how is the decision-making system could work. So what we are hopeful is from this discussion is to get an appraisal of whether the need of this is worth developing further, whether we have articulated the right sets of needs in that case, and thoughts, can I have the last slide, please, about how we can move this discussion forward on its particulars. We want to get a comprehensive response to what are called soft security issues in the classical security space, and to put economic, ecological, social, gender issues on par with armed conflict matters at a global level. So we are looking forward to your input so that we might produce a second, a draft, maybe a 0.15 draft, to further this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harris, for bravely going out and launching a discussion about institutions, which is something that all of us who've been involved in the UN, I think, probably enter with a good deal of hesitancy. I'm very interested now to see what the reactions are from our discussants. And I would turn first to Felix Dodds. Please, Felix is a professor at the University of North Carolina at the moment. Felix.
Thanks very much. I'd like to take the opportunity to comment on the proposal and, of course, say that I think it's important that proposals like this expand the conversation about where we're going. It's very important to put work into these kinds of things. The objective, of course, is to try and end up with something stronger than what we have today, something that is clearly, at the moment, not fit for purpose. So I'm going to make 3 comments to add to the debate. We operate in a real world of 2020, and Tom talked a little bit about that earlier. And what is possible is defined by those in power today and their agenda. There are times when enormous work advancements are made, such as the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. But remember, it took 5 years from Paulo Caballero's introduction of the idea of the SDGs in Solo, Indonesia in July 2011 for the 2030 agenda to be agreed. It's important to also look at the need to have positive governments in key countries. And though the initiative of the SDGs was very much from developing countries, we have some very key players now that have right of center populist governments, both in developed and developing countries. We don't have today the ability to advance major proposals. We would need positive governments in favor of multilateralism in some of those key places. Or at least we'd have to have their agreement that they wanted to move those issues forward. And if they're not in power and they're going to come into power, then we need a narrative that, in a sense, ensures that they don't pull out of any further agreements that we are. I don't believe that non-state actors should have a membership of a new body with any voting rights. I saw it was an interesting proposal, and there was some discussion around UN Habitat of a similar type of idea back in '96. NGOs or stakeholders do not represent the people. Very few are democratic. Policy decisions are taken by a small number of people at the heads of the organizations. Many NGOs are individuals or a small group of individuals. And there's a difference between advocacy and implementation NGOs. So I don't think at this point it's a good idea to move forward on that particular way. As far as setting up formal bodies where stakeholders can inform and share their advice, that's a good idea. A version of the old Commission on Sustainable Development would be worth looking at. From '97 to 2002, the first 2 days of the CSD, before negotiations started, were given to 4 interactive discussions of 3 or 4 stakeholders with member states. The only review that I'm aware was produced by UN DESA on the tourism dialogues, and they said that 70% of the outcome from that tourism dialogue was the outcome from the CSD on that issue. So there's a model there that could be strengthened and could be used as a way of enhancing stakeholder engagement. I don't see the possibility of a new body being created, at least not in the immediate future. As part of it, we'll take up some of the space of a number of other bodies like the High Level Political Forum and bits of ECOSOC. As some of you will know, the reform of the HLPF was meant to be on the General Assembly timetable for this October. It's now been put off till next October, which does offer a chance for reform. But it's important to know that one part of the UN working alone will not operationalize any decision. It'll need the whole organization engaged in it. Stakeholder Forum, my former organization, had a pop-up event at the HLPF in July on Is the HLPF Fit for Purpose? After all, it was set up before the 2030 agenda and the SDGs were agreed to. Stakeholder Forum has launched a report about ideas from that meeting, and I'd suggest that there's an opportunity there for a conversation. The event was attended by all the P5 and the EU and many other countries, so there was clearly an interest in that discussion. Whatever changes we would like to see, we'll need to work out the role of ECOSOC in the context of whatever is going to be created, whether it's an enhanced HLPF or whether it's a resilience council. We never managed to work that out in the context of the discussions around the creation of a Sustainable Development Council for the General Assembly, which was one of the proposals at Rio+20. And I can't remember who it was which was discussing the cyber issue, but disruptive industries will change our lives completely in the next 10 years. It's not just cyber, it's AI, it's biotech, it's AR, it's VR, it's cryptocurrencies, it's quantum computers, it's changes in mobility, it's new energy, it's even 3D printing, to name a few. And these will increase, if we're not careful, inequality in a country and between countries. These are issues I'm raising in the book that I'm working on at the moment, and they show up a huge problem because we're not dealing with the governance issues of these new technologies, or we have no idea of what those governance issues should be. My final comment is to remind people that we do have the Earth Charter, which does give us a great ethical set of principles to engage with. So I don't think we need to reinvent the world, but build on things that already exist. Thank you.
Thanks, Felix. Really good suggestions and reminders about linkages and a dose of realism. I would next ask Patrick Wintour to come in. Patrick is the diplomatic editor of The Guardian. Patrick.
Thank you. Well, I very much come at this as a reporter, not a protagonist, and a think tanker or perish the thought, a intellectual. But you cannot, in my job, but constantly note the degree to which diplomacy is paralysed at present, and obviously the difficulties the UN itself faces and symbolises. And COVID's been this kind of flash of lightning. I think it's one of the best metaphors I've seen in terms of illuminating a dark landscape and revealing things that were perhaps hidden about the lack of leadership, the incapacity of governments to govern, and the whole problem about the systems of global health that we have and the weaknesses within the WHO. But so what I really wanted to sort of look at was really kind of how realistic this idea is. And I just wanted to be slightly optimistic about it. Although by nature I'm one of nature's pessimists, but I just feel on this occasion it's so important, the vacuum we have. And I think the idea itself has some attractions. And I just thought also it was notable when I was covering the General Assembly speeches yesterday, the degree to which there was an understanding amongst the leaderships that spoke, all of which unfortunately were male, was that this was a huge moment for the world. And Guterres described it as a 1945 moment, but the number of people referred to it as turning point, inflection point, were limitless. And I thought Macron was very good in saying, you know, we can't as a world just stand by and allow our future to be decided by rivalry between two superpowers. And the number of speakers that actually mentioned UN reform, the ones I counted were, I think, Turkey, South Africa, India, Malaysia, Argentina, Cuba, and actually some other countries later, including France. But obviously, when we talk about reform, the catch-22, which all those of you who've been involved in UN reform know way better than I, is that someone has a veto. We all can all agree something needs to be changed, but nobody wants to lose any power that they currently have. And however much you point out that the Security Council is currently structured is an historical anomaly, frozen aspect, and it's laughable if it wasn't so tragic that countries such as India do not have a seat on the Security Council. It's very difficult to find a way forward, and the solution largely has been people to think about workarounds in ways in which to get around the difficulties within the Security Council. But so I thought also it was interesting that Guterres said yesterday that he was in favour of reform, but he didn't want a further bureaucracy. And I think the trick in terms of the proposals that you've come up with is to try to present it not as a further bureaucracy, but more as a collation, an attempt to collate and bring together and empower some existing bodies that are currently disparate and don't have the influence that they should do, and to argue, which I think you sort of get to, that the Security Council is dealing with issues of war, but we need a body that deals alongside with the issue that deals with the causes of war. So you have a soft power, hard power dichotomy, one council for diplomacy and prevention, and another council, as it were, for the failure of diplomacy and for war. So I think if it can be presented as that, it might be, and the idea that it's a question of collation rather than recreation of a new body, then it may gain traction. I think the two sort of, well, 3 points I had, one of which has already been made, which is I don't think the NGOs should have a seat that is simply not representative. Sure, they should have an influence, but on a casting vote. And the second is the degree to which sanctions are required, what kind of, and this is more a question, what degree to which we have at present any kind of sanction on any country under the Paris Climate Treaty if they don't stick to their obligations, is to try to explain why sanctions are required, and also to show that sanctions do work. They have worked in the case of the Security Council, because I think there's quite a long argument that they've actually been more symbolic than impactful. And my last point, which is obviously the most difficult point, is that this would require a further loss of national sovereignty at a time when we're dealing with populist nationalist governments who are ever more keen to accrete power to themselves and to offer forms of taking control which require national sovereignty rather than international sovereignty. But thank you. I think it's a very good idea, and I hope there will be many ways in which it can be knocked down and criticised, and I hope you'll have the perseverance to keep going with it.
Thank you, Patrick, for that advice and encouragement. I would next ask Barbara to come in with a few thoughts from her side on this point.
Thank you. As you may know, I hesitated earlier whether to comment here, but I will. Here I go. Okay. The first comment really is on the need, the paragraphs with regard to the need. I think it is underestimating the impact and power, if you like, of indifference and non-action in terms of making sure things don't happen. There isn't enough analysis here, and maybe in the narrative conversation, on the effectiveness of resistance and obstacles to what we are talking about. Also, I think that this dichotomy between military and non actually isn't what we witness in practice. I think the threats, the non-military threats to security in many ways are part of the multidimensional way of waging war today. And I don't think the Security Council would necessarily relinquish its authority if, depending on how things worked. And we have to face the fact that, for example, a number of small island developing states feeling that their security is in threat would like the Security Council to take up their concerns about the threats from climate change. We also know that we have had the criminalization of drugs, of the approach to migrants and so on. So I find that sort of framing needs a little bit more work, as it were. I completely agree with Felix and Patrick about non-state actors not having decision-making roles. I would have raised some questions also about who's identified here as observers. A list is always a problem because of who you exclude. I think our narrative on inclusion needs to be, if you like, changed a little bit to looking at the exclusion, to look at the processes of exclusion, so to speak, and to see how that works in a variety of ways. This wouldn't necessarily address so much of the systemic discriminations, for example, that we're talking about, but I think I can give many examples there. I'm a bit confused about the enforcement tools between the combination of advice on the one hand. We certainly don't have that good an experience between Security Council and Peace Building Commission at the moment. The question has already been raised about sanctions. Do we want more sanctions? We have to recognize that there is a hierarchy in sanctions. If we look at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the way in which its sanctions, as it were, put a claim on public budgets, which make governments change their domestic legislation from the pure threat of sanctions. And also we have a lot of documentation as to where the sanctions have actually been borne. I meant to comment also on the non-state actors and NGOs. I think we've also got to be concerned not only about whether or not they're voting members, but the current pattern that's underway with regard to gatekeepers. We're witnessing too many gatekeepers, if you like, speaking, usurping civil society or other organizations' voices because of actual challenges even about being able to get a visa at the moment to get into the United States, for example. And then on the funding, contributions and participants, including non-state representation. If we look at funding purely from the aggregate point of view, and we don't actually pay attention to the fact that not all funding is actually sustainable. There's a lot of funding to actually keep the status quo, whether we're talking about fossil fuel subsidies or what else. We're talking about the digital divide. I mean, does this mean that big tech will be able to fund? You know from my previous comments that I'm extremely concerned about the relationship between the funding patterns and the concentration of resources and governance and accountability measures. So I would like to sort of see a little bit more along those lines here as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Barbara. I'll now turn to Tom Weiss again for his comments on this idea, the council idea. Tom.
Well, thanks, Richard. My marginal enthusiasm for the narrative is not matched here. I think Harris is going to accuse me of swearing in church or temple or mosque or what have you. I think there are two gigantic problems. The first is this distinction between hard and soft. You know, years ago in the academy, one used to try to talk about high and low politics, bombs and bullets versus technical stuff. And that was thrown out for a very good reason. And I think it's the same reason that this doesn't make much sense. It really represents some differences without any meaningful distinctions. Climate change, migration, AIDS, whatever it is, the Security Council has actually already said these are threats to international peace and security, and I think anybody who looks at them would say the same thing. A footnote to that is also that actually when a problem is securitized, it's usually taken a little more seriously by governments. So I'm not sure you want to dub things of no consequence because they're soft. The second problem, and this has been referred to, I think, is the idea of creating not only a new body, but one that involves the whole system. You know, Robert Jackson 50 years ago called just the development part of this a prehistoric monster, and the monster is now 50 years older, and it's not any more lithe or movable. You know, the Security Council can't decide what to call the pandemic, so the idea of moving to create something new that involves the whole system makes me, I don't know what Jimmy the Greek would give the odds on this in Las Vegas, but not very good. It seems to me that while, rather than dreaming up this solution, the narrative talks about build back better. Really, the most important thing is to reinforce the crumbling foundations of the organization that we have and think about what the UN does better than other people. And we know the body is not any good at subtraction, it's only good at addition. And it seems to me a more sensible proposal would say, well, given what's here, what parts can we actually jettison, you know, that we don't need, have no comparative advantage, lots of other people do better. So instead of dreaming up a new concoction, I'd like to say that what we need to do is think about, well, what if there were 10% or 15% or 50% fewer resources? What parts of this beast would we get rid of? And it seems to me that it's important to keep in mind, and to go back to something I said earlier about the next 25 years, the institution will not disappear, but it's going to be limping along if we continue the way we are. And if there's a budgetary crisis, as there is, and it's going to get worse, the solution is not to chip 5% or 10% or 15% away from everything across the system. It's to get rid of bits and pieces of it. And I remind people actually that the model here is the League of Nations, which actually functioned sort of between 1939 and 1946. So we could have a UN like the League of Nations. It was a couple of people in Geneva and some people at the Advanced Institute in Princeton, and that's what the world body consisted of. So I think that is the danger. You know, so I think modesty is a virtue for members of the UN fan club as well as for social scientists. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Tom. My hair is sort of sticking backwards here. That was a very forthright comment, which we appreciate. This is what we're here for. Before we turn to you, Harris, for a couple of comments, I made the error of missing a second comment from Christiana Figueres, which I think also can help as a wrap-up comment. So we'll hear that now, if we could, please.
I very much welcome the proposed Global Resilience Council. We know that we have been way too late in our action on climate change to reduce emissions. And what that actually means is, consequently, we have to improve our resilience. We have no other option. We have to improve our resilience. And so having a Global Resilience Council that can put its arms around what states are doing, what subnational governments are doing, what other stakeholders in the private sector and civil society are doing, and something that is broad tent that brings all of these efforts together is quite needed, and I dare say quite urgent, in order for us all to mutually benefit from small resilience muscles, which, if all put together, we can actually make much larger and much stronger. So I would like to thank you for thinking into this and for continuing to bring your spirit of innovation and certainly your determination to be able to move forward with the Global Resilience Council. Dear friends, I wish you a very productive day today as you move forward to consider these proposals. I must say you're absolutely in the best hands with Richard and Georgios as as many of you will already know, but those who have never been in Richard and Georg's hands will be delighted at the mastery of their facilitation and their listening skills. So I am actually just a little bit jealous that I'm not there with you to be able to once again enjoy that very collaborative spirit with which Richard and Georgos will, I'm sure, be working with you. So enjoy the process, enjoy the results and the conclusions that you will be coming to, and thank you. Thank you for the very good work that you're doing on behalf of all of us.
Well, Georgos, I guess we have our work cut out for us to live up to that billing. Harris, could we turn to you for a quick wrap up? I'm a little conscious of the time since we're a bit behind in schedule, and I would like to have a time for at least a couple of comments before we wrap up. So Harris, over to you.
I thank you all for your comments and look forward to properly reading those in the chat and others that are sent in. I think that the balance with the new narrative of hope is for us to have a moment in history to say, as in some ways what Tom was saying is that the institutions we built earlier have, and Felix, may no longer be fit for purpose. And so we need to envision what that new arrangement might look like and be bold and challenging. Of course, any set of new suggestions, we've gone through this for every part of the earlier reform discussions, are going to have oppositions from the old world and from inertia. But as part of this effort to talk about a new narrative, we need to think about, do we have the institutions which address contemporary issues in an effective manner? I agree with Tom that the language of hard and soft security issues is not helpful. It's a language in the old security community, not shared by the human rights or the development or the gender communities. But I think that we're trying to grapple with how do we describe a breadth of issues for which there are no equivalent bodies to ones which are put together to avoid a military conflict. The idea of a lightning metaphor, I think, is very helpful. We need to somehow think through how the crises and the responses now to COVID, to the economic crisis, to the non-responses in many of these areas, ought to open up different doors. And I think that what we're trying to do is to make a contribution to describe some of those other new doors, new institutions, which could have effective intervention mechanisms. I appreciate some of the comments about the enforcement mechanisms which were described, but they would be a tough piece to figure out that you want to create a body that's actually going to have some form of leverage in a political world, which is, in picking up from what Barbara is going to say, doesn't want to move. And you need to find a structural way that you can do that. The same problem exists in some fashion and is trapped in the P5 discussion in the Security Council and about avoiding wars between major powers. We have to deal with the issue of power. And just to walk back on the question of how do we try and build out from what we have? And to say that the food and agricultural crises of the world are not being contained by the Rome-based organizations or by other interventions involving the World Economic Forum in Davos. Can we go to the FAO Council and Assembly and say, would you join with other parts of the intergovernmental system to work towards some common responses for identified major crises for which the current systems are not adequately handling? And that relates to one of the other issues that's identified in the paper, is how the agenda for this new body on what kind of crisis could be elevated to these bodies. So I welcome these comments, and I would welcome any additional comments people want to share in writing later as we work on potential next draft. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harris. Thanks to everyone for their points, comments on the two ideas. I've personally found it extremely enriching. Before we try to have a wrap-up of sorts, I would like to see if any of our other attendees would like to pose a question or make a comment or come in. If you could please indicate by the raise hand function. I see though that Jimena has raised her hand and would like to give you a chance, Jimena, to come in as with your thoughts on whatever it is that you heard earlier.
Very quickly, I think that I read the document and also listened very carefully at Harris's statement. I think that it would be important to consider the PVC. It's not perfect, it doesn't have teeth, but right now there's reform fatigue at the UN. So I think we need to consider the incremental approach that Tom spoke, and the PVC is already tackling issues such as climate security. It's considering even more the Sahel and other, and it's, so I would say it'd be good to explore a little bit more the PVC as potentially in the role of the Resilience Council that you're speaking about. Thank you.
Thank you. I noticed in the chats as well that there were a number of questions or comments about the SDGs, and I wondered if any of our panelists wanted to come in with a reflection on sort of what are the implications for the SDGs of this discussion we've been having today, but perhaps more broadly of what the impact of COVID-19 and some of the other challenges that some of the speakers have mentioned. Felix, I see your hand. Go ahead, please.
Thanks very much. I think there's a couple of things. One is, as I said at the beginning, I think it's really important that people are thinking outside the box, but they also need to think inside the box. So there are points where there's an opportunity to have an influence. And the next year, particularly on the high-level political forum, due to the negotiators who set this up, that there would be a review of the mandate of the body, this is an opportunity to put some of those ideas, or at least to have a conversation around those ideas, around the reform of the HLPF. And that was what Stakeholder Forum initiated back in July, and just launched the report that they've done of what was said there. That's an interesting space. It's available now, and you don't have to wait 5 or 10 years. We can do something which could put some of the things into that. I think that's important. Secondly, there is those who don't follow the HLPF will not know this, but they didn't agree a ministerial declaration. It's been pushed off till next year. I guess they're waiting for the US election to enable there to pass that. But it does have in that a look at the targets that are coming up in 2020. And there's 2 papers, one by me and one by WWF, that look at the targets that are available to potentially improve and the particular ways to do that. But you won't reopen the SDGs. It's just a particular set of, I think, 23 targets that had a 2020 or 2025 decision. And you would not want to negotiate those under the present administration in the US, but it may be different by next year. So I think that there's that opportunity around the SDGs. I think Amina was absolutely right. This was a push by developing countries, as was Rio+20 by Brazil. And so the landscape that we have at the moment has come from developing countries. And I think it's a pretty good narrative to help us to deliver also on the climate agreement, if we can get better. There is a report by UNDESA, by Irina, on COVID and VNRs, which is definitely worth looking at to see how that is being talked about. But clearly, building back better would mean ensuring that we are delivering on the SDGs as part of that. And so I think that will be really important.
Thank you very much, Felix. I have two hands up here that I see who I will give the word to next, Barbara and Yorgos. And unless I see more, we'll then move to wrap up just a few minutes past our deadline. So Barbara?
Whoops. A couple of comments on the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. In fact, I flagged the high-level political forum under the creation item here as something to look at, not with enthusiasm. And the reason is not because of the importance of a high-level body, etc., but because it's a forum. And the high-level forum has welcomes everybody and challenges nobody. So if we're looking for a place where people come and are inclusive, that's fine. If we're looking for something that speaks to how to actually get to close this trust gap and the implementation gap and go forward, then it's not a particularly good experience or model. It's recognized here that there have been a lot of attempts at these different kinds of bodies. I work with something called the Civil Society Reflection Group, and we've done a lot of spotlight reports. We bring one out each year that basically is built on analyzing all of the SDGs and how they're implemented in the various dynamics. And I'm happy to forward that if that's of people who are interested. We proposed a Council on Sustainable Development a while ago, which wasn't leading into the Rio conference. And frankly, I have to say, I sat through all of the negotiations in the UN for establishing the high-level political forum. And it was basically three governments, the US, Russia, and can't remember, I don't think it was the UK this time, that basically made sure it was only a talk shop. And so whatever it is that we have going forward is going to obviously face some of the same dynamics. One of the things that's really interesting about the process around the 2030 agenda that also needs a lot more looking into is this whole conversation that we tend to have between binding and voluntary. The Kyoto Protocol was binding, but somehow it hasn't worked. And somehow or other, what are the fallouts for that? Doesn't seem to be very enforcement-ish. And the interesting thing about the high-level political forum is they have this voluntary national review process. And we've had hundreds of countries volunteering. People said nobody would come to report on how they're not doing well. And we've had a number that have been volunteering, in fact, more than once. And it's supporting a very interesting process in some countries only of engagement at the country level. So if we're looking at the global arena to be something that enables more national accountability in all kinds of different ways without having the time to get into, then I think we can be looking at different kinds, who's setting whose agenda, so to speak. And whether in fact we have to face the fact at the moment that the global governance process has become more of a punishment than an empowering process. And I don't like the use of the word empowerment because we only empower ourselves, but nevertheless has become more of an obstacle. And so when we're talking about these kinds of measures, this council and narrative and so on, whether we need to actually flip this to making sure that we only do at the global level the things you have to do and don't become so prescriptive as we have become of what all countries need to do, etc., etc. So I'm glad this is the beginning of a conversation because there's obviously a lot to discuss.
Thanks, Barbara. Before going to Yorgos, I understand that the colleague from the dais, India, would like to come in.
Thank you to the esteemed panelists, and I'm a big fan of a lot of you speaking from India, so it's a big sort of a opportunity to talk. Just three quick points that I wanted to share. One was that the reality and the resilience nature that the different member states face at this point due to the fallout of COVID is not the same. So there is no mathematical function or a model that you can possibly use to see the fallout in Afghanistan, where I work, vis-a-vis Brazilian Amazon, where I work, vis-a-vis Greece, where Dr. Yorgos is sitting, on New York. We have seen so many so far unidentified complex issues that were just swept under the rug. For instance, as Dr. Yorgos mentioned, old people in Europe not getting enough care. Now, WHO has just kicked off the, so what the word resilience means on the first point for different member states may be very different moving forward in the rebuilding process itself. So so that's one point. Second is that, that now that we are seeing that more old people were affected by COVID and young people too, but a lot of burden is being put on young people per se towards rebuilding because they're apparently good at technology as well. Is there something that panelists see as a increased role of young people in this implementation and even deciding this narrative from being done? Case in point, Arturo being the only other young person I saw in the panel. The third is just that GDP not being the only sort of indices moving forward. Do you think that having this still understanding of developing versus developed while deciding certain key any parameters in terms of membership criterias or obligations to pay money could be there? And finally, just last thing for the esteemed panel, if civil societies have a centralized system because of which ethically they can be not given a voting right, what happens to certain nations which have literally the same system? At a political level, are we going to let what we did in 1945, a sense of impunity with many nations, continue in that frame, with them chairing even a plus 25 Beijing, whether it's 25 Beijing or it's any other body which doesn't respect either the UN principles, SDG principles, or this thing, and Goal 16 does not talk properly on conflict and peace? Can we also have something which has a more strongly worded approach towards this rather than sweeping that under the rug in a positive narrative? Thank you so much for the panelists to listening to me.
Thank you for those comments, which I think give us all something to think about. It was nice to see you again. Yorgos, quick last word, and then we'll have a very short summary before we liberate people to go and watch the general debate, perhaps.
If they have nothing better to do, sure. Thank you, Richard, and many thanks to Keshav for introducing this youthful element, and he knows that we take really very seriously the contribution and working together with younger people, because it can only be a coalition of good people, irrespective of age, and certainly with a lot of young people and their energy and idealism, who may change this if it can be changed. And I think that gives us hope. There is hope, and we're working with that on that with DICE. A historical element is, and Janos Pastor was at least until recently with us, about the SDGs. Also, the Global Sustainability Panel had talked about them, and in our report that went to the Rio Plus 20. So there were parallel processes among member states, the Global Sustainability Panel and others during that period, 2010-2012. And there is a problem of tribes in people who deal with international affairs. We can see that in a way here, those who deal with development and those who deal with security. And those who deal with development, they would like to go back to a CSD, Commission on Sustainable Development model, perhaps, and the high-level political forum is another way, another incarnation. Those who deal more with security would like to go for softer issues to the Peace Building Commission, the BBC that Jimena talked about. So what we were trying to say is that something new, and I think Christiana mentioned something like, when you go to the COPs, you can reach up to a certain point with UNFCCC and its negotiations, but then you go to side events to bring the stakeholders together. This would be a kind of the Resilience Council, bring the stakeholders together, whether they would vote or not, but we don't come all together, all the tribes of experts, and also all the kinds of people who deal with economics, who deal with industry, who deal with energy, etc. they're nowhere together to deal with the issues, which the issues have all these aspects. We try to solve them still in silos. And about the SDGs, finally, VNR, etc., the voluntary national reviews, we have used them and we're using them in practice with some countries to see to do a reality test. In Greece and in India, in the case of FOGS, we go and see the foreign ministers basically write a report that goes to the high-level political forum by collating things from the various ministers which are supposed to do something. Whether something is done, which should be done by regional authorities and local authorities, is not really the point for them, but that's the point for the people, from implementation. So I think we need a different approach, going closer to the people, and sometimes it's simpler solutions. And what Barbara said, indeed, it's not like taking everything to the global level, it is at the right level of implementation, and we should focus on implementation, I think, more, with the right framework of principles, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Yorgos, and thank you to everyone, those who participated as discussants and those who have been joining us in the webinar via Zoom and via Facebook. We hope that the discussion has been stimulating and thought-provoking for all of you, because I think, as some of our speakers have pointed out, the situation is not good in terms of where we find ourselves in the world, where we find the multilateral institutions. Finding the right tools and ideas to bring us to a better place is not going to be easy, and these kind of conversations can only help drive that thinking in a good direction. I was struck by the comment by one of our discussants about the importance of countering the growing irrelevance of the UN. I think that's what's behind a lot of our anxiety and what behind our work in FOGS, to come up with ideas and suggestions that would help to give the UN a stronger engagement with the world public. And we heard many ideas. I won't go through them. We will try to capture them subsequently. But there were many points that will help with further thinking on the narrative idea and on the council or some variation thereon. I was really struck by the Secretary General's statement yesterday when he referred to the being at a 1945 moment, was it? He was speaking about being on the sort of cusp of potentially a new Cold War, but I think if we take Christiana's invocation to heart and be optimistic, perhaps we could think that as in 1945, there was an effort to build something which would make a difference for a better world. We need to, for the next 25 years, figure out how we can tame this beast that has been created and turn it into the kind of multilateral institution that is necessary to deal with the problems of the world. So I would say again, thank you to everyone. We really appreciate your taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join us in this conversation and for sharing your thoughts with us. Please do follow up if you are interested. We have the possibility to set up some small working and comment groups if you'd like to be further involved in any of these discussions. And it would be a really privilege for us to continue the discussion with you. So thank you, and I say farewell to everyone in whatever time zone or continent you are, and we will keep in touch with you about the results of this and any further work that FOGS will be doing to advance these ideas. Thank you.